So during my reread of Steel Ball Run for an upcoming video that will probably come later sometime, don't really know when, but I had come across the extra chapters. Every once in a while they show up in Steel Ball Run to give you like a bit more information than the regular series would, and it was about stands. I came up upon the Stone Mask page where it shows the Stone Mask, the Devil's Palm, and the stand arrows all together, while the text roughly says, I'm quoting it here, our ancestors had wisdom that eventually gained this knowledge to make stands, or something along the lines of that, and a brief description on how they figured that out. Then I said to myself, well, how can I make this a video? And if you clearly looked at the title, then you know how I did this. What if stands were in Phantom Blood? So I'm actually going to set up some ground rules before I even start. So it's not really described very well how the Stone Mask actually can give a person a stand, but it does roughly say, depending on a user's personality, you can get a stand. So what I'm assuming here is if you get the Stone Mask and you become a vampire and you kind of change psychologically, you may gain a stand. And we are going to assume this, of course. Also within that extra chapters page, it also describes if you have the spin or Hamon, you have the ability to gain a stand as well, or it's the next step in gaining a stand. And with that logic, I'm assuming that if you become like a master of the spin or Hamon, you have the chance of getting a stand. But I'm also going to say this just because this what if just needs more content in it. If you're a prodigy with Hamon, you will get a Hamon based stand. And this really isn't much of a stretch. We see master prodigy people in JoJo like Antonio, who is a chef, gain a stand because they're just so goddamn good with their craft. They just get a stand. So I'm assuming that prodigies and masters of a certain skill will just get a stand naturally for this whole Hamon part. So where does the timeline split? Well, I do think after Dio got his vampiric powers shortly after the fight with the Joestar bloodline, I do think the timeline splits right before Dio's impact with the Joestar guardian angel. Right before the impact with it, time freezes and the world finally makes its debut, and slightly and ever so gently pushes Dio to the left or the right so he doesn't collide with the giant spike. Events would play out as per normal, but this time Dio wouldn't be heavily as damaged. The next major event to occur would be the meeting between Jonathan Joestar and Zeppeli. The major difference being here is once William jabs Jonathan with his pinky into his kind of chest area, I don't know exactly where he pokes him, but I think it's right under the left lung, if I remember correctly, this causing Jonathan to get some type of Hamon. Of course, this would lead to William being completely shocked at how good Jonathan is at Hamon and Sendo. But of course, with Jonathan being a prodigy at Hamon, he would of course gain his own Hamon based stand. Hermit Purple in this scenario. I don't want to make another original name for him because that would take too long, and to be honest, stand speculation is pretty opinion based. So let's move on. The next question is, well, does Zeppeli have a stand? And I'm gonna have to disagree with anybody that says yes. Zeppeli was already 50 years old when Phantom Blood started, and from what things were in the original series and original timeline, Zeppeli and Jonathan seemed pretty evenly matched. So that's why I said prodigies can get stands. And since Zeppeli is, old as hell and is kind of rivaling Jonathan at this point, I feel like he wouldn't have a stand. But I do think due to his age and life experience, training at the Hamon temple in Tibet, I think he would be able to feel out stands that are based in Hamon. I do think William would end up helping Jonathan's development with his stand, but very little. Everything would probably stay the same up until Win Knight's Lot. Some minor changes would happen, but they wouldn't be so dramatic that I feel like I don't need a cover. Basically, Jonathan just learns Hamon quicker due to him having a Hamon based stand. So the next major changes would take place in Win Knight's Lot. First being the encounter with Dio. It would more or less end up the same, but due to the fact that Dio has the world now, instead of kind of stopping Zeppeli with his kind of freezing flesh ability, he would actually just stop time and just kind of move out the way, or either, freeze Zeppeli while in frozen time. Everybody would be shocked. Jonathan, Speedwagon, Zeppeli, and probably maybe Poco, but he would just kind of be like, what's happening? I don't know what's happening here. I personally don't think Dio would honestly kill Jonathan and William right now, more or less seeing them as like weak and feeble at the current current time right now, he would probably still end up using both Buford and Tarkus. And this is where Jonathan, of course, takes the main character role and speed runs through the enemies. Let's be honest here, Jonathan with a Hermit Purple stand that's probably more developed and probably a lot more unique than it was in part 3 means that he'd probably end up defeating Buford a lot faster than he originally did and probably a lot more effectively. I end up seeing Jonathan using Hermit Purple in a way to keep a distance between him and Buford and putting Hamon through Hermit Purple just like Joseph did back in part 3. TLDR, Jonathan wins. We obviously get this. And I don't think Tarkus makes it very far. I don't think he goes to the chamber where Zeppeli dies. Well, is fortuned to die. Well, not in this timeline, actually. I do think Jonathan would just square up right where, Buford died. They wouldn't go anywhere due to, well, Jonathan having a very powerful stand ability. There's no reason to run this time. Tarkus dies right next to Buford, and the group moves on, of course. We eventually meet up with the rest of the gang, Straightso, Tom Petty, and Dyer. Well, do any of these Hamon users have stands? And yes, 2 of them do. I personally think Tom Petty and Straightso would have stands. Tom Petty, of course, being ridiculously old and being the headmaster of the Hamon kind of group, organization, temple, society, religion, etc. I think he would have been so skilled enough with Hamon, he probably would have developed a Hamon-based stand just like Joseph did back in part 3. Fun fact, Straightso was 25 in part 1. He was ridiculously young during these current events. And he was casually strolling along with 2 Hamon masters, not to mention knowing Zeppeli, so he had to be a skilled Hamon user, probably even a prodigy, so I do think he would have a Hamon based stand. Now in the questioning of Dyer, I don't know if he actually would have one. He has apparently known Zeppeli for a very long time, and since they're about in the same skill level, I don't think he would end up having a stand. He'd probably be able to fill out stands that are Hamon based very similar to Zeppeli, but I don't think he would. If I knew his age, then maybe, but we don't. So what would their stand names be? Well, I think in Tom Petty's case, I'd probably go with the song Time to Move On, and with Dyer, I'd probably go with You're the Last Trick by, of course, Dire Straits, but I wouldn't use the full song title. I'd probably just go Last Trick. Then we move on to the final battle with Dio. Well, how does it go? How does Jonathan and Speedwagon and William save the day? What's wrong with you? Why do you think that? Dio is going to fucking slaughter these men. In part 3, it only takes a single knife to KO a Hamon-based stand user. Dio is a fully fledged vampire with, of course, his laser beam eyes, not to mention the fact that he can still freeze people's flesh. And, he's a full vampire this time around and probably has a time stop of slightly over probably 7 seconds. The fight would probably go down with everybody trying to use their abilities on Dio, but Dio would just be blinking in and out of space. Like, he'd just jump to a different part of the tower and then another one and then another one and then another one. He'd just be jumping around the place consistently. And all that Tom Petty sees with his stand is, well, everybody dying and William being the first one, like his accurate prediction so many years ago. But not to Tarkus, but to Dio this time around. Dio effortlessly claps everybody. Due to them not having a strategy going into this and not knowing Dio's full capabilities of his vampiric powers and his stand ability, Dio would just kill everybody with his laser beam eyes and probably freezing a couple limbs off in the process. He'd probably commend Jonathan for having a powerful stand and for hell even having a stand, but other than that, everybody would just die pretty damn fast. Except for Jonathan, he'd probably be the last one standing next to, Speedwagon. But other than that, Dio just kills everybody. I think Dio's last words to Jonathan would be thanking him for, discovering the stone mask and its secrets. Because without them, Dio wouldn't have become this monster of a character. And that's how part 1 ends, with everybody dying to Dio. Well, that was anticlimactic. So what happens now? Well, with Dio being the winner of this fight, he would of course figure out the rest of his plan and conquer humanity, as him being the apex of everybody else. But before he does that, he has to get rid of something. If these Hamon users were, pretty skillful and probably could have killed Dio if he did make a wrong mistake, he of course would have died. So he thinks to himself, I'm going to eliminate the source problem before it becomes a problem. After infecting all of Win Knight's lot, he would move from the UK to the mainland, probably France. This is the starting location to his long walk / drive, or whatever transportation that is currently there at the time, to Tibet. Dio probably figured out where the Hamon users came from due to the fact that Tom Petty weared traditional Tibet clothing, so Dio probably connected 1 and 1 and made 2. So Dio's journey to Tibet is very interesting. I think this is where the part 3 retcon Dio would show up in a sense. Like, Dio would travel from France to Tibet and would kind of study humans in a way. He kind of figures out the stone mask does something to humans. Of course, they make them vampires, but how did he gain a stand? So, of course, Dio would kind of theorize and kind of do scientific research to a degree. Dio comes to the conclusion that the stone mask has the ability to give a stand, but only when a person changes. Kind of. That's what he's thinking. Of course, he tests out this theory, but he says to himself he'd only do it to a person very similar to him because he thinks that's probably the only way to get a stand. They have to be very similar to him, Dio. So basically, he's just making a small army of vanilla ices. Of course, Dio would find success in this, but I only think it would be good in 2 occasions, once in mainland Europe and in the Middle East. So that means this party of 1 just became a party of 3. They're basically the evil Stardust Crusaders, now thinking about it. But that's not the only thing Dio was doing during this long walk. Every town he would come across, he would infect with his vampiric disease, making hordes of zombies, ghouls, and phantoms all over Europe, and not to mention the Middle East. And probably a little bit of the Mediterranean. Dio in probably a couple weeks or maybe a month or 2 would raise a massive undead army that would attack Europe and the Middle East very soon, or probably during his walk. Meaning that the Great War has started. For the people who don't know, this is World War I. The undead horde versus the Alliance and probably some of the people from the Entente. So yeah, this is fucking crazy. It's basically World at War but zombies. It's World at War zombies. That is what the Great War is now. Back to JoJo and Dio's misadventures. He would eventually come across Tibet with his minions and would end up slaughtering almost nearly all of the Hamon users there at the temple. A few would survive, but not a lot. And to make things worse, since there are 3 vampires now, that means there are a lot more zombies in India and the Tibet regions, meaning that there is a war in Europe and a war in the East now. TLDR, since I don't want to explain this whole part for you, yeah, Dio ends up controlling the whole world in a matter of months. With no Hamon users to help out in this war or teach anybody else, and the allied powers not being so technologically advanced at this point right now, Dio is able to conquer the world. So where do we go from there? Well, I do think Dio would eventually try to make more vampiric stand users very similar to him and his minions, but he wouldn't find too much success. Probably maybe getting 1 more out of probably, I'd say 9, very similar to the 9 glory gods, but he wouldn't be too successful. Dio would eventually realize later in life that stands are kind of weird. It's not the personality that makes the person, it's more like the development of the personality makes the person a stand user. But with already having so many vampires at his control that are very, very powerful, he doesn't see the need of stands anymore. Another major piece of development that would probably happen during this time of, well, Dio ruling the world with an iron fist and having very powerful minions, not to mention very powerful stand minions as well, Dio would probably end up having a lot of kids due to the fact that he sees women as just kind of objects that he can eat and make love with. He of course would end up probably with a few kids, but if he didn't see potential in them, he'd probably just, kind of shove them away. But if one of them ended up being a stand user very similar to Giorno, I think there is a possibility of having kind of like a king and prince dynamic with Dio and one of his sons, meaning that the 9 glory gods become 10. Now there wouldn't be any major development between parts 1 and 2, since all of this stuff kind of happens right after part 1 but very early on. I don't think anything else would happen up until very soon or very close to part 2's beginning. There is a possibility of the heaven plan being forged within Dio's mind, but I don't think it would be fully developed yet. So with that out of the way, we move on to part 2. So what happens? Well, with humanity being broken and beaten and being controlled by Dio, the world kind of looking very similar to Berserk's world, I do think at some point Dio would find out about the Pillarmen, maybe through kind of destroying old monuments to build one of his own. Could they possibly find the Pillarmen? Or through destroying old world governments could they find probably secrets about the Pillarmen. With either of those scenarios happening, up to you to decide which one's probably more probable, Dio and his 9 glory gods would find out about the Pillarmen, and of course a fight would ensue. Dio wouldn't want these guys walking around on his Earth, seeing them as a threat to his throne. So of course Dio would find and attack them. So let's of course set up the stage. We are underneath the Colosseum. Dio and his 9 glory gods plus his son would all be there for the awakening of the 3 strongest Pillarmen. They probably don't know about Santana, and I don't think anybody would find out about Santana since he was in a very secluded part of the world. And if they did, Dio would probably handle it personally or send one of his glory gods, leading to the discovery of the other Pillarmen. But in this scenario, they just find them through kind of the destruction of the Colosseum for something greater. The Pillarmen are awakened, and they are very confused on why they're seeing a massive army of vampires, ghouls, phantoms, and an odd presence in the air. Of course, Wamu would kill off a lot of the zombies in front of them using his hurricane powers, but he would be immediately stopped by one of the vampiric stand users. Wamu would probably lose an arm or a piece of flesh, and this would utterly shock him and the other Pillarmen. Pillarmen are astounded. They're like, what? How did a vampire do this to me? This is not possible. This would make Dio react and probably go on one of his like, I'm Dio, I'm greater than you, and I'm far surpassed you speeches. Very similar to the early stuff in part 3. Dio would exclaim that he is the strongest and the most powerful, and that he is here to kill the Pillarmen that threaten his throne. Of course, Cars or AC/DC would give him the, you're just a vampire, you're weak speech. Then Dio stops time and rocks one of their faces, making them fly across the room. The Pillarmen are in for a fight. With Dio being ridiculously old by now and probably having a lot of stand user experience and vampire experience, Dio would be ridiculously busted. His time stop would at least be 30 seconds at the minimum. Also to mention, Dio's vampiric stand users would also be very similar to him. Having decades to train their stands and use their vampiric abilities would mean they would be ridiculously powerful as well. And that would also go for the regular vampires in the 9 glory gods, but they would only have very powerful vampiric abilities, nothing too crazy. So how would the fight go down? Well, I do think Wamu and AC/DC would take on the bulk of the enemies, but would end up probably losing to the stand users. A lot of the regular vampires in the 9 glory gods would end up dying, and maybe one of the stand users, but I do think Wamu and AC/DC would fall, mostly due to the stand users' abilities. But what about Dio and Cars? Well, this is my favorite part about this what if. We get to see a Jotaro versus Dio like fight with Dio versus Cars. Now, I do think these two would fight outside of the Colosseum, and needless to say, if this ever gets animated or made into a manga by one of my fans, Jesus Christ, this would be so damn epic. Seeing Cars' light mode and his blade arms go against the world and Dio's kind of awesome vampiric abilities would be so goddamn cool. And it would end up being a very close fight, with probably Dio barely winning against Cars, probably losing a limb and massive pieces of his body. I do think he would end up killing Cars. Now, a lot of you are probably going to say, but can't the Pillarmen just eat the vampires? Well, here's the thing. We only ever saw Cars and the rest of the Pillarmen eat vampires that were relatively weak and really didn't explore their powers. The Pillarmen are going up against vampires who have had years of experience training their bodies. So it's very possible that the Pillarmen are going to have a tough time digesting these guys. Pun not intended. And it's never stated that a vampire can't eat a Pillarman. It'd just probably be hard to. I think the Pillarmen would have to be probably extremely weakened for a vampire to eat them. But with that explanation on the part 2 kind of battle, Dio wins, but with heavy casualties. With the Pillarmen out of the way, how does this what if end? With no more Joestars to ruin the Brando bloodline and humanity being enslaved, Dio can basically do whatever he wants, and with the Pillarmen out of the way, he can truly do whatever he wants. And I do think this next event does happen. With the excavation of old human ruins to make room for Dio's kind of monuments to himself, I do think the stand arrows would be found. And since Dio is a man of science and is looking for new sources of power whenever he can find it, he of course would test these things out, eventually realizing these things can make stand users, and of course he would infect his new glory gods. But Dio is a man of science and is always trying to evolve himself, maybe a longer time stop or trying to further on his vampiric abilities. He would of course try to test if he pierced himself with the stand arrow, and of course this would be with the beetle one due to it being the most unique. And Dio in this timeline would end up getting the World Requiem. But I don't think it would be called the World Requiem, most likely due to Dio's probably meddling with heaven and the idea of that, and it probably still being a very big concept in his head even after part 2, and this kind of event happening in between parts maybe 2 and 4 at the latest in the timeline, so basically the late 90s. I don't think the idea would be there yet. Basically meaning after getting this new stand ability, whatever it may be, maybe time and space manipulation, making Dio a fourth dimensional being, he would probably end up calling it maybe the world heaven or something along the lines of that, because he believes that this is a true peak of his power, believing that this is heaven. And this is the conclusion to the what if. After this part, basically Dio becomes an unstoppable god. So yeah, if any other threat were to come around for whatever reason, maybe a Hamon rebellion with the, the Stone of Aja, it wouldn't really do anything to Dio since, fourth dimensional level being. I'm gonna be honest, I loved making this video. It was very interesting going in depth on this type of topic. I've always kind of wondered it and just kind of thinking it out and kind of theorizing and plotting around. This kind of does make sense to a degree. Dio with the world in part 1 would basically make him an unstoppable monster. And I know I probably glossed over a lot of stuff, maybe some minor details that a lot of you guys are probably wondering. So if you have any questions, just put it in the comments and I'll probably answer it. And sorry that I didn't put it in, but this video was running for way longer than I originally thought it would. So yeah, that's the end of the video. Like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, stay hydrated. See you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen.